Gen 2 Chevy Astro and GMC Safari ignition coil and ignition control module replacement. This AC line is being held up by a bungee cord. Same with the many vacuum lines that run through here. The bungee cord is hooked up to the handle by the passenger side airbag. At this point, the negative battery terminal has been removed. First, disconnect the connector to the ignition coil. Pull back on this tab and then push up. Same with the connector for the ignition control module, only it's facing away from you. Remove the spark plug cable. It has been pre-loosened for the smoothness of this video. Sometimes they get pretty hard to remove. At this point, you can remove the ignition control module. It only has two 5.5 millimeter bolts. And if your ignition coil has been replaced before, most likely it has bolts right there. If that's the case, you can remove them and change the ignition coil. You will need a wrench to hold the nuts at the back of the coil. I recommend removing the bracket due to the limited space behind the coil. Getting a wrench back there could be tedious. If you still have the original ignition coil, you're gonna have rivets holding it to the bracket. So in this case, you're gonna have to drill out the rivets, and most likely you're gonna have to remove the bracket. To make some space, you can remove the connector for the purge valve. It's the same type of connector. Remove the connector for the map sensor. And now you should have plenty of space to work with. Plenty of space. The bracket is secured via two studs. Use a deep 10 millimeter socket and an extension for all fasteners in this section. The stud closest to you should be of no problem. The other stud has a second bracket and a nut on top of it. To remove that second bracket, remove that nut, then remove a fastener holding the transmission dipstick tube to the second bracket. The second bracket holds the throttle cable and cruise control cable in position. There's one more bolt accessible from the front. You can just loosen this one up in order to slide off the second bracket from the stud. No need to remove the intake. Now you can remove the stud from the first bracket and slide it out. I did manage to find a factory ignition coil. See how it still has rivets? Here I would drill and punch them out. With the two bolts, two nuts removed, you can swap in the new ignition coil. Tighten down the fasteners. Clean the bracket. In this case, we have a used ignition control module. A new one runs about 80 plus, a used about 15. What you want to do is clean the thermal compound from the back of the module, from the heatsink, and from the bracket. I used super clean. Once it's clean, you're going to add thermal compound to the back, to the heatsink, and a little bit to the heatsink that goes to the bracket. A nice layer of super lube. The ignition coil is ready to go. Put a thin layer of thermal compound on the bracket, and the ignition control module is ready to go. Nice layer of thermal compound on that. Thermal compound is white, and if you fail to add thermal compound to the heatsink, the ignition control module could fail prematurely because it's going to overheat. The bracket is back in place. I had no issues with the two studs. I basically held the bracket in place while I used this long extension and socket to thread in the two studs. At this point, you can reconnect the connectors. Don't forget your spark plug wire, and that should be it. Have any questions? Feel free to leave a message. Other than that, have a good day.